Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Monique and today we're going to be ranking all the books that I read in 2023. Now, everyone else released this mid-December, but I have finally gotten around to finishing my beautiful bookshelf and miniature copies of all the books that I read last year. And so I thought it would be a good time now to go through the about 40 or so books that I read last year, from worst to best. I loved a lot of the books I read this year and I could care less about a lot of them too. The first category is, why did I bother? I just wasted my time finishing these books, really. Alright, the first book we have is called 18 and Lost by 9 different authors, most of them Australian, I believe. I'd kind of been listening to this little podcast that one of the authors had started, and it just seemed very interesting. It was all about, finishing high school and entering the young adult period where you're trying to work out what you want to do, and just 9 different stories and 9 different paths that people took. It was just some chapters by certain authors really hit you over the head with their message. It was just a bit dumbed down for my taste, and there were quite a few spelling errors because it was self-published by the 9 of them. Next we have An Offer from a Gentleman. I think I also read a different book of the Bridgerton series. I don't remember which one. I just remember getting it out on the library on my phone while travelling and probably reading it in like an hour or two. This only took me a day to finish. I didn't like it. It was very poorly written. I didn't care about it. Alright, on to the next category. We have It's a book. Now this one is very controversial. It's Normal People by Sally Rooney. It was a good, well-written book, but it wasn't for me. I just hate the miscommunication trope. Like the first time, sure, whatever. But how do you accidentally break up with someone when all you're trying to do is ask if you can stay with them over the summer? I'm sorry, I was lost at that point. There were some nice quotes, but it really annoyed me. We have A Court of Thorn and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. And again, I know it's a very popular book, and many people have told me that the subsequent books in the series are a lot better. But if you have to get through the first one, is it really worth it? So I can't be bothered finishing the rest of the series. I'm sure it might even be an interesting world, but also, she is 16, and they are thousands of years old. She is 16. Come on. Anyway. I don't care about that book. I don't ever need to see it again. I don't need a physical copy at all, which I'm glad I got it out from the library because I don't need that taking up space on my bookshelf. Can't Hurt Me by Dave Groggins. Now I just randomly stumbled across this book and started reading about it, and it was quite interesting reading about his life and all that he's gone through, and wow, his grit, it's really up there. But also, mate, take better care of your body. It was a book. And yeah, it was kind of interesting to see his point of view, but also there's so many worlds apart that I don't have much connection to him or the experiences he had in his life. The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Barnes. I don't know what I was expecting when I went into this book, but it's not the book I got. It's almost like Knives Out, the movie, in some regards, but not as good, and also less murder. But it was just the ending that kind of lowered the whole book for me. Moving on, we have Electra by Jennifer Saint. Now this book, it sort of follows the story of Troy and Helen, but from other women's perspectives. And there were some characters that I really loved, some characters, like the namesake, that I really hated, and I think you're supposed to in some regards. And one of the lines in this book was probably one of my favourite lines that I've read in a book this year. Like a lightning bolt shattering the centre of my life, the cracks in the earth spiralling from it in every direction. I knew that the madness within me had not been building to that moment, but rather the echoes of his devastation had run back through my years as well as forward. Oh my god, amazing. I would read this book just for that quote, but the overall myth and legends surrounding these ancient Greek characters, I much preferred Song of Achilles. Read that, that's so beautiful and just such a kind of book. And this was just an interpretation of some Greek myths, and it was fine. Apart from that line shattered my soul. We have a book called Dying by Corey Taylor, and this was a memoir written by a woman who was dying from cancer, I believe. And it was quite interesting to see, to really think about how much death is removed from modern day life, and the fact that people kind of hide it and hush it when truthfully everyone is dying, always, and she just happened to be able to see it approaching, and that has some very interesting effects on your mind and also the way you live, and it was just very cool to read about. Moving on to the next category, called It Was a Good Book. This book is called The House of Hollow by Crystal Sunderland, and I picked this book up for its cover. You're kind of taken along from this girl's perspective, and she doesn't really quite understand who or what she is or what's happened in her childhood, but her older sisters seem to know more, and it's kind of also grotesque in the same way Electra was. Next, we have The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osmond. My friend gave me this book while we were travelling to read. Basically, the premise of this book follows these characters in not nursing home, but like home for the elderly and people living there, and someone gets murdered and all of that gets dug up. Next, we have Heidi, which my friend Heidi had, and so I read it while I was staying with her. I did enjoy it. I probably would read it to my kids a lot. It's quite fun and short. Next, we have Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood. I read maybe 3 of her books last year, and I liked all of them well enough. This is probably the book I liked the least. Didn't so much like the main love interest, but also her books kind of all blur together in my brain, so I just know that this one wasn't my favourite of hers. Next, we have Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. This guy is a doctor who studies sleep and how sleep and lack of sleep affects us. Now, this book is very informative. It's definitely more of a publishing of the research, but it was just quite thick and heavy to get through because there were lots of studies referenced and just a lot of information bubbling up all over the place. So it's kind of a book that you read like 10 pages a night kind of thing and just slowly chip away at it, but a very important book to read, and I now know some very interesting things about sleep and how necessary it is for us. And so this one is called The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jaku, and it's about a survivor of Auschwitz. And I always find it very interesting and fascinating reading how people reacted to situations and lived through situations. And I do believe that he now lives in Australia, I think. The next book, The Crossing by Sophie Mattison. This book records the true journey that Sophie took with camels from the edge of Western Australia all the way to the east. She walked the entire length of the continent from west to east, and this book kind of follows her emotional journey as well as her physical one. Next, we have the first book that I read last year that took me several months to get through because it was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And look how thick that book is. I actually have it right here. What a hefty beast. Now, this world I didn't find particularly interesting in the same way that I love other fantasy worlds. It did have some interesting elements, but it was something missing from the world which kind of pulled me back from it. But I did manage to get through it. It was a gift from a friend, and I'm glad I read it. It kind of makes me feel proud to have read this book because it is a beast. Moving on, we have The Psychology of Money. An interesting read, a good read, I think, very important to understand finances and particularly how you view the world and your psychology affect how you deal and view money. The one thing I did find about the book is that most of them were quite obvious. I wonder if people just don't think about how like their personality affects how they deal with money, but I just found I knew most of the things in the book already, and there wasn't a lot I gained from actually reading it apart from just, oh, that's right, yes. And so it was a good kind of reminder, but it didn't like shatter the way I thought about money. So the next book I read is called Someday is Today by Matthew Dix. I read another one of his books first, and then I read this one. It's all about making the most out of every day you're alive. He's had a lot of shit happen in his life to him, which is quite interesting. But it's interesting also to see how his life experiences have shaped how he uses his time. He still has a very normal, average, everyday life. And I think it's very important that we read books and memoirs about people like that who aren't any different than the everyday folk. Alright, next we have Born to Run by Christopher McDougall, a book that talks about running and how the human body is designed to run, but less from a research standpoint and more from an observational basis. It has some very cool ideas about how we should run and how modern technology can inhibit the way our body is naturally designed, particularly as I'm training for an Ironman this year. I'm not trying to pull together as much knowledge as I can. Next, we have a book that I got from a secondhand bookstore in Amsterdam, and I just randomly picked it up, but it was honestly a brilliant, funny book. It's not like wow, but it's also just a fun read with a very, very long title. The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared by Jonas Johansson. It was originally written in Swedish, I believe, and it follows a 100-year-old man who decides on his 100th birthday that he's had enough of living in the nursing home. He climbs out the window and sets out on the run. And then over the course of the book, we kind of flash between current situations he's in and his life over the last 100 years. And I mean, it is entirely fictional, but this character gets to be at every major event of the 20th century, and it's just kind of like, imagine if this guy was the cause and changes of all these events across the last 100 years. And so it was a really, really fun read. First, we have two more Ali Hazelwood books. We have Love Theoretically and The Love Hypothesis. And I do like romance books, and when they have like an undertone of science and fun, it's nice to read some books that are different and kind of showcase really intelligent women who not only want a career but also want love as well. Next, we have a classic, Animal Farm, which now that I'm talking about should rank higher, but from here on out I read some pretty good books, so it's kind of hard to place any higher. I still have about 15 to go. This book in particular is such an interesting take on how slowly introducing something and making each step seem at least somewhat reasonable, you can convince, manipulate, control an entire group. And but by the time anyone wakes up or realizes what's going on, they're so far down the track that it's almost impossible to stop. And how that kind of affects society is something I find deeply fascinating, so it was really, really cool to read, and I'm so glad that I finally got to reading it. We're leveling up a category here. We're getting to some really good books that will be getting harder and harder to separate. But next we have I Understand the Hype. They might not be my favourite, I might only kind of like them, but I understand why they're either very popular or I just really, really liked them. We have Fourth Wing. And I really did quite like this first book. I didn't love it, like hype it, but I did really like it, and it kind of reminded me of my top book of the year, and I'll explain more about the comparisons that I draw between them later on when I get to it. But I liked it, I thought it was really good, I loved how it went, and then I started reading Iron Flame. I read this over Christmas, so I read it all in one day, and then the next day I had Iron Flame, and so I started reading that, and I was like, oh, I'm not even going to bother finishing this book. What's the point? We're literally right back at the start again. Like, this book was so well written in its character arcs, and she's making her way through the first school year, and then we get Iron Flame, and by that point I was just sick of forming bonds with characters and then them immediately dying. And I don't get the hype. I think there are better romance fantasy books out there, but if it gets people into the genre, I'll be more than happy because it is one of my favourite genres. Next, we have The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And this book I also got from the Amsterdam secondhand store. And I was just reading it at the hostel, and a guy walked past and was like, oh my god, I loved that book. It was a 5-star book. It was so amazing. And I was like, oh, okay. So I had high expectations. And it was a good book. Wouldn't hype it so much. It's probably only about 3.5, 4 stars for me, but it was a good book. It follows this girl at the end of her life where she's kind of removed from reality and she gets to explore the different paths her life could have taken. And over the course of the book, she tries out many different lives. I did like how it ended and how she kind of came to terms with the life that she did have and the decisions that she had made throughout her life. Next, we have Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I read most of this book a few years back before I truly got into reading again, but I thought I would read the book again and take some notes and really try and implement habits into my life, because there's no point reading books like this if you're not actually going to take something away from it and really add and improve and change your life. I can't say my life is dramatically different, but I do think that this and other books that I've read have probably influenced me more than I know. And who knows, I might look back in 10 years and realise that my life has actually been changed a lot by reading Storyworthy by Matthew Dix, which kind of explores how important stories are to people and humans, and how important it is to be able to tell stories effectively in an engaging way, and how stories can transform your life. And as someone who likes making films and loves reading, it was really cool to read a book about storytelling and what it means to tell a good story, but also what stories are and why they're so important to humanity. Alright, we'll get into some of my favourites now. This is the upper end of I Understand the Hype, and I really did love these books a lot. So next we have Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, and this is the second book in a fantasy series that I started last year. That first book, Assassin's Apprentice, was actually probably one of my first true fantasy books that I read, which is surprising because I feel like I've read a lot now. But I loved it. I loved that book so much. It was very much kind of point to point to point, which I found that most fantasy books seem to be. Kind of have like a more dry tone than other genres, but I did really love it. This book, however, kind of went on a bit too long, and my love for the series kind of dwindled out. And I was like, I cannot be bothered slogging through this fantasy book for that plot. This book was cool. It wasn't as great as the first one, so much so that I just can't really be bothered reading the third. But anyway, moving on, we have another fantasy book, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brendan Sanderson. Now this book is a really sweet book. I haven't read actually many Brendan Sandersons, and it is my plan to this year. But I was waiting for this book to come out for months because I really loved the premise, and I think this is a really, really good book for like 13-year-olds onwards. Like, you're never too old for a book, but I'm probably just a bit outside the age demographic, and so even though I loved it, probably wouldn't say that like I loved it, you know. But anyway, the story follows Tress, who lives on an island in the Emerald Sea, which is made out of spores on this planet rather than water, that actually react to water, and there are many different spore seas, and spores each do something differently. But she is a really awesome heroine who sets out on an adventure to save her friend because no one else is going to. And she's about 16, and it just follows her overcoming all of these challenges sort of as a pirate kind of person. And it was a really sweet book. Alright, next we have Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmans, and I was so excited when the TV show was announced. I didn't like the TV show as much as I loved this book. It was a good book. Again, I read it in a day, so actually remembering my true feelings about it is a bit hard, but it was such a good book, and it's such a beautiful cover. Can't believe the American cover. No, it's such an awful cover, but the UK and Australian edition is so beautiful. This book follows a young woman, Elizabeth, who's a chemist, and all she wants to do is be a chemist and study chemistry, but of course it's set in the 50s, and she faces a lot of misogyny and prejudice over being a woman, but she finds love and trying to make her way in the world as a woman and a scientist in the 50s. Next we have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and last year I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which was in the top 5 books I read that year. I really loved it. This was still a really good book. It wasn't as great, but it was really cool. Next, we have another memoir, I'm Glad My Mother Died by Jet McCurdy, and this was a very popular book last year. I was really blown away with how she was able to transition the kind of prose and her style of writing from the way she kind of writes as a child, with a child's perspective and diction at the start of the book, and slowly as she gets older she starts making more nuanced connections and understands how her childhood and the things she went through affect her now. And I just loved how it got more complex, and her writing style got more complex, and the thoughts that she had developed as well throughout the book. It was just a very cool way of writing that I haven't really seen before. The last book in this series that almost made my top books of the year is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book kind of founded the dark academia sphere. It's kind of cited as the starting book in that kind of subgenre. But it follows this character, Richard, who moves states for university to study ancient Greek in this kind of exclusive section of this college, and he is very much an outsider, the other 5 characters having come from significant wealth. And so you kind of explore and see their world from Richard's perspective. But then they get embroiled in murder, which is not a spoiler because it happened, because you learn about it on the first page, but it kind of builds up about why this character was murdered and then the repercussions of the death of this character. Alright, this last category, there's these books here I love with all my heart, and they have a piece of my soul. So we have 2 books to start with, the first being The Rings of Saturn. But this story is quite bizarre and odd, but really cool, and follows this guy as kind of travels through the south of England as he reminisces on events of history and other random things. I don't quite understand what happened in it, and that book, along with The Road Chose Me by Dan Gregg, which is all about a guy travelling overland from Alaska all the way down to Chile. Both of these books I read in the week before I went travelling myself, and they really, I think, influenced how I travelled and my perspective on travelling. And I really can't wait to read the other books that Dan Gregg has written, because he has now travelled across Africa for 3 years and done a lap of Australia in his car, all living out of jeeps and stuff like that. And I would like to do that one day. I would love to overland across South America, and so I would love to keep reading more of his books as well. Next we have The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. I read this book again in the last week before I went travelling. Then on my travels I got to go to the secret annex in Amsterdam, and I just found the journal so poignant and beautiful, and I'm actually quite surprised that it was published in the time it was, because she really does talk about a lot of things that were taboo at the time and wouldn't have been welcomed really. I think it's such an important piece of history, and I'm glad I read it when I did. Next we have my last few favourite books. These books I really need to reread because I loved them so much. They're 6-star books in my opinion, and they're personal preference. I loved them. I loved the mood I was in when I was reading them and the time I had when I was reading them. And all of these books I read in a day. So I do need to go back and reread them and just exist in these worlds a bit longer, because how can I truly know how much I love them if I was only in them for a day? So first we have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. This book follows a young woman born in 17th century France who makes a deal with the dark to escape her fate of marrying and living out her life in this small village in the fields of France. But of course, this deal comes with a consequence, and as a result, as soon as she leaves and is out of sight, the people around her forget about her. And so over the next 300 years, you kind of follow her journey and her desperation to leave a mark on the world, all while this dark kind of works against her. And I often think that the ending can make or break a book, and in this case it really did make it for me. I was nervous towards the end of how it was going to end and how they were going to deal with her character and how her arc was going to finish, but from what I remember, because I did read it quite fast, I loved the ending. It was the perfect ending. Alright, we're on to the last book, but really it's a 3-book series, but I loved this entire trilogy so much that I count this as one big all-time favourite book, 6 stars, and it is A Deadly Education Scholomance series. So we have the first book, A Deadly Education, The Last Graduate, and The Golden Enclaves. The main character, Elle, might be my all-time favourite protagonist. I just love her so much. So basically, in this low magic kind of world, magic kind of exists alongside our normal everyday life a bit. However, it's a very dangerous earth, and these monsters are trying to constantly kill young wizards, mages, magic, because once a wizard is fully grown, there's literally nothing that can stop them. But as children, particularly during puberty and adolescence, they attract monsters towards them, towards their mana is what it's called, And so in order to deal with that, the kind of society has formed this school about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that's kind of walled off. You chuck the kids in there, they've got to fight to survive, and even though the survival rate's not high, it is much higher than being outside the school. But the world has a very interesting politics, and you know, there's like a level of, if you belong to the enclaves, you come from like protection and wealth and you get all this support, whereas if you're a lonely like outsider, you don't. And I love this series so much, and I think that's kind of why I like Fourth Wing. I wouldn't have liked Fourth Wing as much, but it reminds me of this series. And really the first books are very similar in the way they parallel. Fourth Wing is definitely a book for adults, whereas A Deadly Education is more of a YA series. Violet kind of looked down upon because of her physical weakness, even though she comes from like the highest level, even though she in the hierarchical terms is, you know, her mum is the commander. Whereas Elle in The Deadly Education, she is immensely powerful, but she comes and she's right at the bottom of the social ladder. Elle is born to a mother whose affinity is healing, and in a world where other mages and wizards, and I don't really know the correct term, charge for their services, her mum will give it away for free. Her natural affinity, to balance out her mother's, is like pure chaos and evil, can make super volcanoes explode and can mind control 1,000 people and turn them into an army of zombies. And yet she was raised by this beautiful mother and she has the morals of her mother, and so she has to fight against her natural instincts the whole time, all while trying to get through this school and deal with the people around her who are just, they don't make her life easy. The monsters don't make her life easy. And all of that is in the first book. And she's working towards this goal, which is almost purely survival, in the same way that Violet is just trying to survive Fourth Wing. But unlike Fourth Wing, you get to the second book, or you get to the end of the first book, and something happens that completely shifts the goal. Now Elle has a completely different motive, and that influences the second book. And so even though she has moved up into her final year of school and you're still at the same school, the whole book is different because she's aiming towards a completely different thing. I do think people might struggle with how heavy the lore is, because there's a lot to pick up on, but now I have to go back and reread this series and truly spend time in the world. Now that I know what happens to the characters, I can kind of relax a bit and just love the world that Naomi Novik created, because those 3 days that I spent reading these books, I just loved. So that is all the books I read last year. There are a fair few of them. I'm already 5 books into 2024, so this video is very late, but better late than never. I've been loving reading so much, and so now I just have to restack my bookshelf with all my miniature books. I love them, they're so cute. Anyway, thank you for watching my video. I hope you subscribe and stick around because I have lots more videos coming this year, and I'm just gonna have fun with them really and do some fun, cool things. So I'll see you guys later. Bye.